Hello friends, and welcome to Butterfly Meadows Homestead. I'm Dorinda. Today we are going to be continuing our series on reviewing the different functions of the bread machine. But today we're going to change it up a little bit. Today I'm going over the quick bread function, and to make it more interesting, we're going to make a loaf of quick bread. There's a lot of confusion about quick bread and the bread machine because generally speaking, when you speak about quick breads, not referring to the bread machine function, a quick bread is a bread that uses baking powder to rise, or baking soda. Baking powder is a combination of baking soda and cream of tartar, which is an acid, and baking soda, of course, which is an alkaline, and when those two combine, they create a chemical reaction that creates carbon dioxide, which creates little tiny bubbles and causes your bread to rise. That's what is used in cakes and biscuits and cornbread and like banana bread, sweetbreads, those kinds of breads, is a baking powder, not yeast. Those breads, called quick breads, do not need a fermentation time like yeast bread does. And they also do not need to be kneaded. So, because you want that fluffy cake texture in those breads. But when you're talking about quick bread in the bread machine, it actually has a fermentation period, and the quick bread function on the bread machine is not made for those cake-like breads that use baking powder to cause them to rise. Because if you let a bread like a banana bread or any other kind of cake-like bread, let it ferment for 30 minutes or so, you're probably going to have some deflating take place, which will not come back. Unlike yeast, you know, your yeast bread can rise, you can punch it down and knead it and it will rise again because those yeast colonies are multiplying. But in quick breads that are traditionally called quick breads, where they use baking powder and baking soda and cream of tartar, those kinds of things to rise, once the rise takes place, once that chemical reaction takes place, and it's triggered by the liquids in the bread or the cake, once that rise takes place, it does not happen again. So if it rises and then you stir it down, you're not going to get another rise because it only happens one time. So the quick bread function on the bread machine is not made for cake-like breads that use baking powder. It is made for a quick rise yeast bread. And I'm going to show you how to make one. It's a really great function. You can have bread, however long your quick bread function is on your bread machine. Most of them are ranging from an hour and a half to an hour and 45 minutes, somewhere like that. You can have a delicious yeast sandwich bread, or we're going to be making cinnamon raisin bread, and it is just delicious, and it's just so quick and easy to make. That's what the quick bread function is. And I'm just going to quickly, before I get into making quick bread, raisin bread in our bread machine, I'm going to go over the working timetable for the quick bread function. And it's very simple. So you choose the size of your loaf, and a 1 pound loaf has a 1 hour and 33 minute working time total. A 1.5 pound loaf has a 1 hour and 36 minute working time total, and a 2 pound loaf has a 1 hour and 43 minute working time total. And on the KBS, that time does not change based on the darkness of the crust. What it will do, if you look here at this table that I'm looking at, it will stir for 3 minutes. And that's called the first stir. But there is no rest period, and then it will stir for 17 minutes. So that is 20 continuous minutes of stirring. It will stir for 20 minutes, then it will ferment for 28 minutes. There is nothing in between the first stir and the ferment, and after it ferments for 28 minutes, it's going to bake for 45 minutes for a 1 pound loaf, 50 minutes for a 1.5 pound loaf, or 55 minutes for a 2 pound loaf. And that is all the quick bread cycle does. Now you might say, well, how can I make a yeast bread that doesn't do a rise and a punch down and a second rise? You can make yeast bread, quick breads, yeast risen quick breads that way. They just won't have probably as intense as a flavor, because that second rise, the more often you let that bread rise and punch it down, let it rise and punch it down, you can do it 2 or 3 times or even more when you're making bread until you overproof it. But when you're making a yeast bread, and it just enriches the flavor, because that fermentation makes the yeast flavor stronger, and other flavors in the bread, it just brings them out. So this bread won't have as rich of a yeasty flavor as your traditional sandwich bread made on function 1, the soft bread setting, would have, but you can hardly tell the difference at all. And if you use a good bread flour, a high gluten bread flour, you're still going to have a nicely structured bread that is soft and chewy and strong enough to hold together to make sandwiches. When I make this raisin bread, I actually use it to make sandwiches with, because it just makes delicious sandwiches, and toast. It makes a wonderful toast. So this recipe is pretty simple and straightforward, and we're going to jump in here and I'm going to show you how to make it on the quick bread function in your bread machine. Now remember, I will have the recipe for this bread in the description box below this video. One of the most important things about making this quick bread is that your liquid ingredients need to be warm. They need to be at least about 104 degrees up to about 110. You don't want to go too high, because you'll kill your yeast. I like to stick to around 104 degrees or so. Just a little bit above body temperature is good. So you're going to need 1 1/3 cup of liquid. I am using milk. This is powdered milk that I have made. And I'm going to measure out 1 1/3 of a cup. And then I'm going to put this in the microwave just to get it warm. So since I used the microwave, I'm going to go ahead and take the temperature of this milk, because I want to make sure it's not too warm and that it is warm enough. And it is only at 82 degrees, so I'm going to pop it back in the microwave for another 15 seconds or so. Now let's see what temperature we're up to. That's wonderful. We're up to 106 degrees. Just going to stir it a little bit. And I love this grill thermometer. I use it to check the temperature of meats when I'm cooking them, breads to see that they're the right temperature, and my liquids when I'm making bread. I have it in my Amazon shop, and there's a link below in the description box that can get you there and you can find it. I really recommend having one of these if you're going to do a lot of cooking and baking. So we have our milk up to temperature. Now, what we need to do is put our ingredients into our bread pan. Make sure your paddle is in your pan, and I always oil my stem and so that the paddle can come off easily, because I like to take that out. It keeps me from having that giant hole in my bread. So we're going to pour our milk into our pan, and we need 1 tablespoon of yeast. And that's quite a bit of yeast, but and that's 4 teaspoons or 1 tablespoon of yeast. And the extra yeast helps because we are doing a quick rise. It just helps to have that extra yeast, because remember, if we were doing it the traditional way, we would let it rise, punch it down, and let it rise again. That would increase the amount of yeast that was in the bread, but we're only going to have 1 rise and 1 kneading session, so we're using 1 tablespoon of yeast. And we also want to add 1/4 of a cup of white sugar. We are going to add 1 1/2 teaspoons of salt. we are going to add 1 teaspoon of vanilla. And we are going to add 2 tablespoons of oil. I'm using canola oil. You can use any kind of oil that you want to use. And this is a 2 tablespoon measuring spoon. So I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of oil. Now we have raisins here and brown sugar and cinnamon, but we're not going to add that yet. Now I need 3 cups of bread flour, and I have my bread flour here in a 5-gallon bucket. So we need 3 cups. That's 1, 2, and 3. Now that's all we need right now. Now when the timer goes off for us to add our raisins, then we're going to add in our raisins. You could also use your fruit and nut dispenser that came with your machine if you would like to, but I'm not going to do that because I am mixing, I'll show you in a minute what I'm mixing together, and I don't want to put all that in my fruit and nut dispenser for this bread. So we're going to put this in the machine. So we are going to choose menu option number 6, which is the quick bread function here on the KBS machine. We are going to choose the 2-pound loaf size and medium crust. So that gives us 1 hour and 43 minutes total. And we're going to let this mix. And like I always say, you want to open this lid and make sure everything is mixing together good. I always like to take a spatula and rake down my sides. Make sure everything is looking good. And it's going to be a fairly wet dough, but that's okay. We're just going to let that mix, and while this is mixing, I'm going to show you what I do with my raisins. While our cinnamon bread continues to mix, I'm going to show you what I do with my raisins. Now, if I have really dry raisins, like maybe you've had them for a while, I will soak them in warm water for about 5 minutes. But these raisins, it's a fresh bag that I just opened and they're very moist. I'm not going to soak them. What I am going to do is I'm going to add 1/3 of a cup of brown sugar to these raisins. And I'm also going to add 1 teaspoon of cinnamon. Now, if you have other spices that you like to add to your raisin bread, would be a good time to add them, or you could add them before you turn into your bread machine, before you turn the bread machine on. But I just like to add it here to my raisins. I just like the way that it turns out. And I'm just going to mix these all around, coat the raisins in the sugar. It seems like coating the raisins in this sugar helps them to be super moist in the bread. So I've got that all mixed together. And now I'm just going to wait until it is time to add them. When the fruit and nut dispenser alarm goes off, then I'll add them, and that should be happening soon. Okay, that is our signal to put the fruit in. I'm going to pause the machine just so I can show you as I put it in, and I want to show you what the dough ball looks like. It's pretty tight, and I'm going to go ahead and put my raisin, sugar, and cinnamon mixture carefully in. Try not to spill it into your bread machine, and turn it back on and let it mix this in. And I always watch mine and make sure that it is mixing everything in together. And sometimes if your dough ball is really tight and you have a lot of structure in your dough ball, it's hard for it to get everything mixed in. So I watch it carefully. If I think it needs a little help, I'll pause the machine and kind of knead the raisins and cinnamon and sugar into the bread. But we'll see how this goes. Let me go ahead and turn it back on. And it's doing a pretty good job of mixing everything in. Sometimes I just like to pause the machine and I just kind of mash down on the dough ball to help it grab a hold of those raisins, because you want them to be mixed in thoroughly. So I just kind of help it sometimes, because I don't want all of my raisins to end up on the bottom of my bread, which is what's going to happen if they don't mix in. And when you're making a yeasted bread that has, you know, your dough has a lot of gluten structure to it, sometimes you just have to help it. And see, now those are mixed in much better. So that's just a little tip on how to make sure your raisins get all incorporated. Now that they're sticking in the dough nicely, they will get mixed in to the dough ball really well. And they're not just all in the bottom of the pan being looked over. Now after the kneading cycle, stirring cycle is complete, which takes exactly 20 minutes, so there'll be an hour on this setting that I'm using. There's an hour and 23 minutes left. I always remove the paddle because that'll keep us from having a hole in our bread. And this bread doesn't have a knockdown or a second kneading cycle, so I'm going to go ahead and remove the paddle. And I always just make sure I put the bread back, the dough ball back level once I take that paddle out, so that I don't get a misshapen loaf. Now this is a sticky bread, but that's okay, that's what we want. So I have the paddle out, and now all we have to do is wait for it to rise and bake. So our bread should be done any moment now. We're just waiting on the beep. I just wanted to take this minute to tell you, if you're enjoying these videos and haven't subscribed to my channel, please consider subscribing. Share these videos with your friends, hit the thumbs up button, and leave me a comment below. Let me know if you have any questions, or if you tried the recipe, or if you're enjoying these videos. And that would be great. There we go. And that's my favorite time, is when we take the bread out and see what a beautiful, tasty creation we have made. You always want to make sure you either unplug or turn your bread machine off, because it does keep warm for like 30 minutes, and there's no need it heating up if there's nothing in there. And take your bread out of your pan as quickly as you can. And we are going to let this cool for a few minutes, and then we'll come back and slice it up. So our bread is fairly cool, pretty cool, and we're going to go ahead and slice it up. And this bread slicer guide is very old. I got it at a thrift store years ago. Occasionally you can find one like it on eBay if you want to go there and look around. It's a Presto bread slicing guide. I know a couple of people that have found them there. I have a bread slicing guide on my Amazon shop page, but I think it is out of stock. I'll try to update that with a guide. They just don't make them like this anymore, but I'll try to put one there that is as close to this one as it can be. And I'm going to be using an electric knife to slice into our bread. And you always want to start, if your bread slicer guide is tilted, you want to start up on the high end so that the bread won't shift and mess up the thickness of your slices. Okay, so we have our bread sliced. We'll just open it up here and see what it looks like. Oh, it's so beautiful. Just look how beautiful this is. Oh, it smells so good. It is some beautiful raisin bread. The texture is just wonderful. And I've made this several times, and I know it makes wonderful sandwiches and it makes wonderful toast. So I really hope you will enjoy the quick bread setting on your bread machine and make you some delicious raisin bread. Just as a note, you can use this exact same recipe, just leave out the raisins, the add-ins, the raisins, cinnamon, and brown sugar, and you can make a wonderful white soft bread. It's the same recipe, you just leave out the add-ins, and it makes a beautiful white bread to make sandwiches with as well. I'm so glad you joined me today. Thanks for stopping by. God bless. Bye-bye.